Welcome back, welcome back. It's been yet another week of turmoil on the financial markets, but is it a global meltdown? We've heard so often now that whatever happens in the US and Europe, the world will be insulated by China and India, that we've perhaps come to accept it unthinkingly. But is it true? The evidence suggests otherwise. This week, the Chinese stock market fell by more than 10% and the Indian one by 8%. Two of the worst falls anywhere. So are the emerging superpowers really the world's insurance blanket? I'm joined now from New York by Indian economist Arvind Panagariya, who's the author of this authoritative new book out this month, India, the Emerging Giant. Welcome, Arvind, welcome. Tell me, can the rest of... Thank you. Can the rest of the world really sit back and allow China and India to protect them from the worst of a global slowdown? And I mean, does India and China have that ability?
Well, India and China cannot really stop the rest of the world from declining. They can provide some cushion. They are currently large economies and growing rapidly themselves. They do get impacted naturally by what happens in the rest of the world, particularly China, because China is very much hooked up into the global economy, very dependent actually on the exports to the US markets in particular. Nevertheless, being large economies and rapidly growing, they do provide some cushion, but we can't be complacent about it for sure. Whatever happens in the rest of the world is bound to impact, as we have seen actually at least through the stock markets, the Indian economy and the Chinese economy as well.
And in terms of the actual effects of this sort of thing, if there is an ongoing recession in the United States, can China and India, particularly we're talking about India of course, can they avoid it, or would they would be affected? You were saying they would be affected, but would they have the same sort of recession or not?
No, I really don't think so, particularly in the case of India. India is still has a lot of domestic momentum, and the sources of growth in India are predominantly domestic ones. What I expect is that perhaps, if the US economy does go in recession, or let's say, a cut from growth rate, which had been between 2 and 3% to no growth at all, maybe India's growth rate will be cut by 1.5%, but not by much more. So what we are talking about is, in the current year that ended, in the year that just ended, growth rate has been about close to 9%. It'll go down to about maybe 8%, a little below that, but I think momentum is there, and at least whatever signs one can get right now from what has been happening in terms of the investment activity, etc., I still feel very optimistic that the 8% growth rate will actually be maintained.
Well, that's good news and so on. In fact, over the last 25 years, China has grown faster than India, obviously, although India's had 9% growth in the last 3 years. Will India catch up with China in that sense, do you think?
Okay. Now, if we are talking about India catching up with the Chinese income levels, that is a pretty long race. Even currently, Chinese economy is growing faster by 1% or so than India. It is already about close to 3 times that of India. So for India to catch up, it will take several years. Now, question really here is whether China can maintain its current growth rate, which is doubtful. No country so far, including like Korea and Singapore, have maintained that kind of growth rate as long as China has maintained. So chances are that the Chinese economy will somewhat slow down, Indian economy will somewhat accelerate. But even then, in terms of catching up with per capita incomes and the GDP levels in China, I think we are talking, something like 25, 30 years of time. That's what it's going to take. But remember that if it does happen actually with India and China both growing that rapidly, India catching up to some degree with China, the global economy's center of gravity will certainly shift very much to Asia.
Thank you very much for being with us. Good luck with the book, and we'd love to have you back and consult with you again.
Thank you very much.
10 years ago, this very day, the Good Friday Agreement was signed in Northern Ireland, and a new future was set out for the troubled province. After 30 years of bloody struggle between nationalists and unionists, which had resulted in more than 3,000 deaths, representatives of the two sides came together in a power-sharing assembly, and the plans for that too. One of the main architects of the agreement, a man who jointly won the Nobel Peace Prize and went on to be Northern Ireland's first minister indeed, was the leader of the Ulster Unionists, David Trimble. And he's with me now, I'm delighted to say. David, welcome.
Yes, thank you.
Did you feel, looking back now on the Good Friday Agreement, did you realise how important it was, what a turning point it was, what a bit of history it was at the time? Were you conscious as you negotiated?
I was certainly conscious that it had the potential to be a turning point, and it had the potential to be the settlement of the issues and the problems that had beset Northern Ireland over all that time, but I wasn't absolutely sure that afternoon whether it was going to work. And we did have difficulties with certain segments of public opinion. We did have difficulties in terms of implementation. Some parties were very slow to fulfil their part of the agreement. The implementation has taken nearly 10 years, longer than I had expected, but it has now been fully implemented, and I think now most people in Northern Ireland would accept that this is the settlement of the problems that we had for so many years.
That's fascinating. And what were the couple of most difficult moments when you thought that it might all fall apart?
Well, during the beginning of the referendum campaign, we'd agreed that the agreement be put to the people in a referendum. The referendum campaign got off to a really bad start, and it was over one of the issues that turned out to be so difficult, prisoner releases. The then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Mo Mowlam, arranged for the temporary release of some particularly notorious IRA prisoners in order to ease the acceptance of the agreement on that side, but it caused huge problems on the unionist side, who were appalled at this and it being done so quickly. And indeed, the way in which Mo Mowlam and to some extent also Tony Blair was more solicitous of Republican opinion than Unionist opinion was a problem the whole way through the implementation period.
And in fact, the irony of it was that, I mean, the SDLP on the left and the Ulster Unionists to the right were the people who carried this thing forward, really, initially. But in the end, it's the DUP, the Paisleyites, and the Sinn Féin who share most of the power now. Is that an irony that the makers of history are often left beached by history?
Well, the actual agreement was based upon the two moderate parties, the Moderate Nationalist Party, the SDLP, and the Ulster Unionist Party, the Moderate Unionist Party. The agreement was based on them and was made by them. Neither the DUP nor the Sinn Féin actually made a significant contribution to the agreement that we hammered out on that day. And we now, as you say, have the irony that they are there. And of course, one has some views about that. But actually, the advantage of that is that they too now have put their thumbprints on this agreement in a quite unequivocal way. And we can say now that there's no segment of opinion in Northern Ireland which is opposed to the fundamentals of the agreement. And so that hasn't worked out too badly. I doubt myself whether these parties are actually capable of meeting the challenges of the next steps, which do have to focus, I think, on improving community relations and dealing with the legacy issues that come from it. I think we've settled the causes of the conflict. I think we've settled the political problems, but there will be some legacy problems which I don't know that they're going to be able to handle satisfactorily because of their past as extreme parties.
What a good phrase. What are the legacy problems?
There's the problems of victims. Now, that is an issue. Some victims have behaved really in a really selfless fashion, but others still have difficulty with the situation. And there are still areas in Northern Ireland where there are what we call interface areas, areas where the two communities are rubbing up against each other, areas which have caused a lot of difficulties in the past. There are particular community relations issues there that have to be tackled, and they can only be tackled by people who enthusiastically accept the principles of the present arrangements, rather than people who've come to them reluctantly and to some extent, equivocally.
I see, and so that's legacy issues. What else is going to come up? What are the other problems that, as you say, you've got a broad agreement on the basic thing that started 10 years ago today. But what are the other disagreements or the things that need to be tackled? Is there a problem, for instance, with paramilitary violence and paramilitary
not really.
hoodlumism? No,
not with paramilitary violence per se. There are some dissident paramilitary units, elements who are reluctant to accept that the conflict is over, who are trying to restart the conflict, but they've clearly no significant popular support, and they're failing to do that. The difficulty would come more from former paramilitaries who have privatized themselves and are now involved in racketeering and gangsterism. And that's essentially a law and order issue, and one where I'm confident in the long run the new policing arrangements will be successful, are indeed already having a degree of success, and that I look forward to see that happening. But we are now, like most parts of the world, we have a problem now with organised crime, whereas 30, 40 years ago Northern Ireland did not have organised crime. So.
No, but it is privateers, as it were,
yes,
who are doing this. It's not an activity of either parties on the left or the right.
Yes, I think it's true to say that now.
And what this tremendous struggle that there's been to achieve what's been achieved, do you think there are any lessons from these negotiations, protracted negotiations, that would, for instance, be instructive, constructive for instance, to take another dispute, an obvious example, but Israel and Palestine? Are there lessons to be drawn from Northern Ireland that could be applied to that?
I'm reluctant to say that there are lessons, because each situation has got its own history, its own dynamic, its own particular issues. I think people might gain some insights by looking at what has happened. Yeah. I certainly gained insights from looking at other situations, but at the end of the day, it is the people in each situation who have to solve it for themselves. And it's not something that I or anybody else from outside can really come in and say, you know, this is what you should do. One can offer encouragement and support, but at the end of the day, it is the people there who have to do it. And the really crucial issue, I think, is, are the people there willing to make an accommodation with the other, or are they trying to achieve a victory over the other? If they're still trying to achieve victories over the other, then clearly there can't be an agreement. But if they're prepared to accept the reality that they're going to have to live together and find a way of working together, then you've taken the first huge step towards a solution.
One final question coming back to Northern Ireland. Are you going to miss Ian Paisley as a major force in Northern Ireland politics or not?
I suppose it's possible I could get nostalgic for him, but I think it might be some time.
Well, that's a perfect point on which to end. This has been a delight to talk, David. Thank you very much indeed, and thank God for the progress that's been made in the 10 years, as we said, since the agreement was signed, Good Friday 1998. That's it for this week. Do join me 7 days later for another Frost Over the World, but until then, goodbye and thank you for joining us.